Welcome back to our conversation about classroom cover-ups. And if the first point of this conversation that we had with Eric made your blood boil, get ready, because we're not just talking about policies anymore. We're going to be talking about patterns of protection, patterns of silence, patterns where administrators, school boards, and even entire districts opt to quietly move on from problematic staff rather than risk confrontation, headlines, or lawsuits. And when they do, well, that predator walks away with a resignation, not a record. The behavior doesn't end, it just changes zip codes. And what do we call that? Passing the trash. It's not just a phrase, it's a system-wide sleight of hand that's been going on for decades. A legal dodge where schools knowingly allow teachers with red flags, sometimes serious ones, to resign before those allegations ever reach the point or official reporting. No formal complaint, no criminal investigation, no call to Child Protective Services, just an empty desk and a vague explanation, and in many cases, a letter of recommendation. Yes. Oh, we had all these parents outraged at what you were saying and doing with their children. Here's a letter of recommendation. Go away. This isn't just a one-off. It's a strategy. We've got documented case after case, many of them where schools refuse to formally report abuse concerns. Thousands of them in the last few years. Why? Because if they do, it triggers mandatory reporting obligations and opens them up to liability. But if they keep it internal, the whole thing disappears. It's clean. It's quiet. Catastrophic if something happens. We're going to be digging in with Eric Faddis to explore the legal tightrope schools are walking and how they're using it to their advantage. What legal responsibilities do they actually have to report? What happens when they don't? And how the hell does a system with so many supposed safeguards keep letting monsters walk into new classrooms with clean records? Let's get into it. Let's talk about when people see something and people then say something, because they do. And there's a lot of people. The problem is not necessarily reporting, I think. It's more so what's done with that reporting. Now, do people hold these things in? Yes, they do. But there are we certainly are in a society where people seem a bit more vocal than they used to be. And they're not as ashamed to come out and say, hey, this happened. This needs some attention over here. What are the incentives, if any, for an institution, legally, financial, reputational, to avoid going and reporting this to the authorities? Just because it goes to CPS doesn't mean it's going to the local news outlet, which probably doesn't exist anymore. It's pretty much podcasters because local papers, local radio's gone. So you don't necessarily have that. I mean, what are the incentives to not report this? This seems like it's a very steep mountain over here if you fail to do the right thing over here.
Certainly, there are obviously optics issues. Look, if a school hired on somebody who is a threat, somebody who's a problem, somebody who potentially might abuse children or other people, that's a bad look for that school. There's arguments that they should have engaged in better background checks. Perhaps they'll get less enrollment. Certainly, if it's a private institution, that could mean a financial loss substantially for that institution. And so on top of that, just wanting to maintain a good name within the community is of value to these schools, of course. But they're really taking a gamble on this thing because every now and again, something slips by and they try to keep it under wraps, and then that person hurts somebody else. And now all eyes are on those prior institutions. It's a gamble that's not worth it.
I guess my other question is, are districts not involving legal counsel enough to get an accurate answer of what they should be doing here? I mean, walk us through a likely scenario. A credible allegation is made, and instead of reporting it, the district lets the teacher resign. I mean, who's making this call? Is it like the superintendent, the school board, the principal? Is the legal counsel getting involved, saying, "Hey, let's just let him resign and move away"? Because it seems like a liability as well. If you're the attorney advising the school, this might not be the best idea. Are they shying away from legal advice, in your opinion, and going by going more and like rolling the dice, because our odds are nothing's going to happen. We've been doing this for a while and getting away with it. But, you can only go down that road for so long before something, comes back to roost.
Tony, are there too few lawyers involved in these decisions, or are there too many lawyers involved in these decisions? Yeah. That's a legitimate question. And I'm a lawyer. And what I can tell you is that, the lawyers analyzing these determinations, they're trying to look out for the best interests of their client. Hopefully they're identifying, like you said, a massive civil liability. And on top of that, hopefully they're advising on what the right thing to do is. But that's not always the case. Sometimes lawyers have been used to sweep things under the rug, to say, hey, if you word things in such a way in the internal investigation, that can sidestep or appear to sidestep a further level of action that you need to take. And so, here's how you do it. Let's just quietly try to resolve this, get this guy to resign. And if he's out of our school district, it's not our problem anymore.
I mean, there's sometimes contracts or sometimes settlement agreements that come into play here that explicitly prevent the district from discussing the situation with future employers. I mean, these are like self-imposed things that the district will put onto itself from a legal standpoint. Does that make sense? I mean, you're exactly right. Are there too many lawyers involved here, where you also have the possibility, which has happened, where accusations are made, they are found to be not necessarily provable, but look, most of these accusations aren't very provable. But when you have a trend of them over and over from different people, it shows that might be something going on. But there are issues where accusations are made, nothing is found, doesn't get to CPS, they fire the employee, and they go back and they sue the district, saying, look, you never found any proof of this, whether it's real or not. So they're also facing litigious action from both the employee that has the accusations against them, if they're not true or just they're not provable. And then you also have the possibility of legal action against you should you let that person move on, or you're not allowed to say what happened to the next school district. Doesn't that like squarely put the district that's having the problems in a target for legal repercussions that are kind of self-imposed by their own doing, but also because they don't have much of a choice?
Certainly it's a legal quagmire, but hey, look, we're dealing with kids. These are sensitive issues. They're going to be hard, complex legal questions that arise. They still have to do the right thing. And look, if they're agreeing or entering into a settlement agreement with the employee, for example, and there's some kind of provision whereby the school side cannot discuss these allegations, perhaps because they weren't provable. That is absurd. We are silencing these school districts that know about information that other school districts might want to know about because it goes to protecting the children. And so, them sort of silencing themselves and agreeing to these provisions whereby they cannot discuss the allegations, I think is antithetical to mandatory reporting requirements. It's antithetical to protecting children and transparency in the employment process when we're talking about teachers who deal with kids on a day-to-day basis.
And in a way, this is obviously we're talking about kids, so it's more sensitive than I guess just your average employment office type situation. But these sort of problems exist in other areas of life as well, other institutions. We see it in policing. We see it in many other areas, medicine as well, and just regular employment from different places. And in the last handful of years, you may have noticed, or some of our listeners may have noticed, that when you apply for a job elsewhere from your current employer, or you're looking to get a recommendation from your current employer, quite often the answer is, I can confirm your employment dates. And there's not a ton of, yes, we can say anything about you, good or bad. And a lot of companies have just adopted we're just going to do dates, not good or bad, that way. And it's insane because if you're a great employee, you're just dated. And if you're a bad employee, you're just dated. It's not really an advantageous thing to a productive employee, but the same thing is going on here. Can a future employer, are they even allowed to ask why the teacher left? Or is that protected? Does an answer have to be given? Of course they can ask, but does an answer have to be given? Or does that start to fall into one of those categories of you can't ask that in a job interview?
As a general rule, I don't believe an answer has to be given. I'm not aware of any legal requirement that the prior school would have to inform the new school about some kind of issues. Now, sometimes different jurisdictions and different school districts have their own idiosyncratic requirements in that locale. But generally speaking, if school number 2 calls up school number 1 and wants information about the teacher, school number 1 is not under a legal obligation to give that. Should they be? Should there be some sort of provision whereby the prior school has to provide the employment file or disclose any sort of concerning information that could be reasonably calculated to pertain to abuse or neglect? Perhaps those requirements should be put in place, but I'm not aware of any across the country.
Is there also a reason here as well at play, do you think, that maybe schools don't want to ask that question? They're already starving for teachers. They basically need bodies in positions. So if you get somebody who has the degree, has the teaching certificate, it's not just a sub, it's somebody that they can put into this position and check that box that we have that filled. If they were to ask that question and find out something they don't like, maybe not necessarily something that would legally prevent the person from being hired, but more so, well, there was accusations, but they came out to be unfounded, and that's what it was, never got turned over. It was just, and they know nothing more. That still doesn't necessarily prohibit that person from being hired. There are unfounded allegations out there that are legitimately unfounded, that are just somebody saying something. But if they were to have knowledge of that at some point along that hiring process, there was a warning, unfounded warning or unsubstantiated warning, but a warning. Does that in itself just open up the school to a whole other bunch of liability should that teacher turn out to be a monster and do something, and then the school is shown as having prior knowledge? So if we don't ask, we don't know. And if we don't know, you can't go after us for knowing something that we didn't already know.
You're exactly right. I think it touches on a very significant issue in our education system. These schools are trying to balance a number of interests. Like you said, they've got to get warm bodies in there to teach these kids. There's a teacher shortage on the one hand. On the other hand, they've got to make sure they're making safe decisions for the children in their care. And so where do those lines kind of cross when we're talking about what information that the subsequent school is asking about? Surely, from a purely legalistic standpoint, it makes sense to not come into contact with information that's going to subject you to civil liability, to being sued if something happens. But you got to weigh that against sort of a more altruistic interest of needing to protect the children in your care. But it doesn't surprise me that schools would be shy about learning really the depths of all the information, lest they come in contact with something colorably problematic, and then either they can't hire the person, or if they do, they're on the hook for a lawsuit.
So now we know mandatory reporting might sound reassuring on paper, but in practice, it's full of big holes. Enough for a predator to waltz right through, straight into another classroom. What we're seeing isn't just a failure to report, it's a coordinated effort to avoid responsibility, a deliberate strategy where schools weigh their own reputations against the safety of the children in their care and choose silence. Eric hit it square on the head. When a district uses internal investigations as a substitute for legal accountability, they're not just bypassing law, they're actively undermining it. It's not their job to judge and jury. When a student, parent, or colleague comes forward with a concern about inappropriate conduct, the district's role isn't to figure out if it's real, it's to report it, period. That's the whole point of mandatory reporting laws. They exist because schools aren't equipped to run criminal investigations. They don't have subpoena power. They don't have forensic teams. What they do have is a legal obligation to get that allegation into the hands of people who can actually investigate it properly. Child Protective Services, law enforcement, whoever's appropriate. Instead, what we see over and over again is this toxic pattern. A school gets uncomfortable, and instead of alerting authorities, they handle it quietly, they accept a resignation, they give a reference letter, and they wash their hands of it until the next district makes the same mistake. This is how someone like Andrew McGann ended up in Arkansas with no red flags in his file, ready to start fresh, until it ends up in tragedy. And yet no one seems to be held accountable for letting him slip through the cracks. So now that we've exposed how districts manipulate this system to avoid reporting, let's pivot to the policies that allow this behavior to persist. Because it's not just bad actors making bad choices, it's a system built with loopholes big enough to bury the truth in. We got another conversation coming up with Eric. Press subscribe so you don't miss it wherever you're watching this or listening to this. YouTube, podcast platforms, just search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi and press subscribe. Do it in both places so you can take us wherever you are. And let us know in the comment sections what your thoughts are on this case and this problem that doesn't seem to have an ending. Until next time, I'm Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again real soon.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast.